What is going on, Headliner Nation? Welcome to the Week 15 Waiver Wire Show, where today we're covering everything that you need to know to start off Week 15 of fantasy football. Now, millions upon millions of fantasy football players will either start their playoffs this week or next week. Now, unfortunately, the waiver wire doesn't care about your fantasy feelings. I mean, does anyone else out there feel like this fantasy football season has aged you like 12 years? We have been put through the damn ringer this season. I mean, the injuries aren't stopping. Now all of a sudden the weather is affecting games weekly, and every week just feels like Groundhog Day. But we persevere and push to the finish line, so in today's show, we'll be going through the typical subjects, the top injuries that we saw in Week 14, the best available players on the waiver wire, some waiver wire power rankings, we'll play starter stash, FAAB budget recommendations, and then we'll end it with some Streamin Ds. Now, there are timestamps to all of these sections down below in the description, and if you appreciate that, do me a favor and hit the like button if you haven't already. But okay, it's Monday, and I could once again use something to get the juices flowing, similar to what we did last week. So I thought it would be fun to try another little Monday Night Football double up on Underdog. Now, last week in this very show, this ticket hit. If you played it, you more than doubled your money. So let's go ahead and try it again. This week, a little iffy, right? A lot of unknowns surrounding Omarion Hampton and Justin Herbert, so that makes things a little bit riskier. But this week, I'm going with Dallas Goedert over 19.5 receiving yards, Ladd McConkey over 4.5 targets, and Cooper DeJean over 4.5 tackles and assisted tackles. If this hits, it's a little bit more than double your money once again, but the deal gets better than that. So right now is still the time to get all signed up on Underdog so you can come play along with us. So head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app, create a new account using the referral code Headliners when you do so. Then just make your initial minimum $10 deposit. But the best part, anything you win is money directly into your pocket, so week's worth of fun for $10, it's an absolute no-brainer. Now, links to everything are down below in the description, but now let's go ahead and take a look at a few of the names that got banged up in Week 14. And unfortunately, Week 14 was just like the 13 weeks before it. There were a ton of injuries once again, a lot of quarterbacks in Week 14. Daniel Jones tore his Achilles. He's done for the year. He's probably done for the next 9 months. What happens to the future of Daniel Jones? Jaden Daniels, he returned from an elbow injury and then left the game early in Week 14 with that same elbow's injury. However, there was no significant injury. There wasn't one play where you could see the actual injury happen. Now, reports have already come out and said, hey, he could have been put back into the game if it was needed. But my question is this: is it needed in any game rest of season? Because it's not going to matter at this point anyway. Why would we throw him back out there and risk future injury where it's affecting other seasons? If it's me, I'm shutting him down. We'll have to wait and see what happens with Jaden Daniels. Tyrod Taylor suffered a groin injury. He could miss 2 to 3 weeks. Geno Smith, he suffered a shoulder injury. It is his throwing shoulder, so don't be surprised if he misses some time as well. But then we get down to Devon Achane, who suffered a rib injury. Now, potentially, he's going to play in Week 15, but do not be surprised if he is limited most of the week. The worst part here is he plays on Monday Night Football. And how irritating is it to not know whether one of your top players is going to play until most of the other players have already played? They did come out and say that he could have returned in Week 14 if needed, so fingers crossed he should be there this week. Zach Ertz, man, I hate to see this for Zach Ertz. A suspected torn ACL. His season is over. More than likely, he could be retiring after this injury as well. Hate to see it. He was playing great football. CeeDee Lamb, don't forget he suffered a concussion. It happened on Thursday night last week, so he does have a few extra days to clear the concussion protocol in order to play on Sunday night. But if I had to guess, more than likely he doesn't practice any, if at all, until end of the week. And then Roma Dunze, he popped up towards the end of the week last week with a foot injury. It is a stress fracture, which has now taken his status to week to week. That could result in him being placed on IR and his fantasy season being over. Now, we can speculate whether or not this is what's been hampering him the last few weeks that has caused the dip in production, but it is what it is, and more than likely, he's done for the season here in 2025. Now, there is one bit of good news. We have no more bye weeks, right? No bye weeks for any teams. The byes are over. We should have everyone who's healthy, available for our fantasy football team. So let's go ahead and dive into the must-add players here for week 15. It's disgusting. Listen, at this point of the year, it's a recycled mess. Before we get into the names, let me just tell you this. If you have a top running back, just be sure to have his handcuff if you possibly can. I understand that some of your handcuffs may be on different teams. Just don't allow one of your top handcuffs to be out on waivers heading into the fantasy playoffs. But all right, let's go ahead and dive into the quarterbacks first. Shedeur Sanders here on the list. He had a great game. And I know there are a ton of Shedeur haters out there, but when the kid plays great, he deserves a little credit. He's only 8% owned. He's got a matchup upcoming against the Chicago Bears. He was the quarterback 2 overall in fantasy football this past week. He had 364 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception, and another 29 yards rushing and a touchdown on the ground. And now he gets a matchup going up against Chicago, who has allowed over 19 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks over this entire season. We also once again have Marcus Mariota of the Washington Commanders. If Mariota goes back to being the starter, he's only 10% owned, has a matchup upcoming against the New York Giants, but what's going to happen with Jaden Daniels? Even though we think he should be shut down, are they really going to? I can't imagine that they're going to play him and risk further injury in games that do not matter. But we've seen Mariota already a lot this season, and this is a great matchup for him going up against the Giants. On the season, the Giants are allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. So if you're in need of a quarterback this week, Mariota would be out there for a lot of people. But we should probably also mention Tyler Shuck of the New Orleans Saints, only 1% owned going up against Carolina. And on the surface, Shuck doesn't really seem like a fantasy option that anyone is interested in. But he has now scored multiple touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games played, including his matchup against this Carolina defense just 4 weeks ago. But there's also a little bit more there for Tyler Shuck. His rushing upside over the last 3 games has been great, with 95 yards rushing over his last 3 contests. I mean, you never really know what Carolina defense is going to show up, and with Shuck's rushing ability and the way he's throwing the ball down the field more and more often each week, he's probably a plug-and-play type option here for fantasy football. Do I have the warm fuzzies on the inside? Not really, but if you're desperate for quarterback, there are worse options out there than Tyler Shuck. Now, after that, we got a couple running backs to mention. Blake Corum is a name that we have talked about for multiple weeks now, but he's still only 30% owned. He was in this show last week. We told people to pick him up and start him. And if you did, it paid off great. Because as LA has continued to give him volume, he has continued to capitalize on his touches. He now has 212 total yards and 3 total touchdowns over his last 2 games alone. Now, LA has already come out and said they want to keep Kyren Williams fresh for the playoffs, so there's no reason to expect the volume to go away from Blake Corum here down the stretch. Now, after Blake Corum, we got Jalen Wright of the Miami Dolphins going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Don't nobody out there own Jalen Wright, but a lot of his potential is dependent on the health of Devon Achane. Now, obviously, reports have come out and said, hey, Achane should be good to go, but stranger things have happened in 2025. Unfortunately, they don't play until Monday Night Football, so we probably won't know until later in the week. If you are an Achane owner, you better have Jalen Wright on your bench just in case. Look what he did last week. He racked up 24 total touches for 107 yards and a touchdown. Now, you may end up adding him and Devon Achane is a full go and he does absolutely nothing. Okay, that happens, but I would rather be safe than sorry at this point of the NFL season. Now, after Wright is another guy we have talked about probably for like 3 or 4 straight weeks now. It's Chris Rodriguez, but he's still only 32% owned. He's going up against the New York Giants, and Rodriguez continues to do a lot with a little. Washington was blown out in week 14, so they really couldn't focus on the run. However, Rodriguez still had 10 carries for 52 yards. Now he gets a Giants defense that has allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs on the season. It's a great matchup. He's getting volume, and if you're in need, he's out there for 68% of leagues. But his opponent in that game is on the waiver wire as well. It's Devin Singletary of the New York Giants. He's 26% owned going up against Washington, and we saw Tyrone Tracy get banged up in week 13, but then they had the bye in week 14. Is he fully healthy? All signs are pointing to him being good to go, but even with him healthy, Singletary has had at least 10 touches in 5 straight games, and he's had at least 8 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4. Now with the matchup going up against Washington, they allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Devin Singletary could be a low-end flex option for us here in Week 15. Now, if you're out there looking for a couple pass catchers, we got a couple names. Jaden Higgins in Houston, he's 40% owned going up against Arizona. He's now had 5+ targets in 5 straight games. It was a cold and difficult game against Kansas City last week, and he didn't do much, but now he heads home to face an Arizona Cardinals defense that has been absolutely cheeks lately. With so much defensive attention going the way of Nico Collins and Dalton Schultz, we could see Jaden Higgins, especially in good matchups like this, go out there and be flex worthy. How about Ryan Flournoy of the Dallas Cowboys, only 1% owned going up against Minnesota? And yes, CeeDee Lamb is currently in the concussion protocol. Now, if he clears the concussion protocol, the value of Flournoy is going to take a big hit. However, if CeeDee Lamb were to miss this game, we've seen what Ryan Flournoy is capable of in this offense, including 9 catches for 115 yards and a touchdown just last Thursday. Now, after that is Luther Burden of the Chicago Bears. He's 15% owned going up against Cleveland, and with Odunze being out with a foot fracture, you better believe that Luther Burden is now in line for a bigger and bigger role towards the end of 2025. He's had 6 targets now in back-to-back games, and next week, it's a Cleveland matchup in which they're gonna have to throw the football. It could be tough for them to run the ball on the ground against Cleveland, so if they're throwing, Luther Burden's going to have an opportunity at a big game in Week 15. Then we also have Jaden Reed. He's 40% owned. We've talked about him for numerous weeks as well. An upcoming matchup going up against Denver, and really, I feel like we've been talking about him forever, but he finally made his return in Week 14, didn't really do a whole lot, and now gets a difficult matchup against Denver, but he could be very useful in Week 16 against Chicago. So maybe you don't need him, but if you'll be playing in Week 16, you can grab him and block him from one of your opponents. Now, if you need a tight end, the football kind, there are 2 great options out there. The first one, Isaiah Likely of the Baltimore Ravens, only 8% owned. The dude is going up against Cincinnati, and you know we start every tight end against Cincinnati. Now, Likely was listed in this show last week. If you grabbed him, you found yourself a top tight end in Week 14. He's one of Lamar Jackson's only / favorite weapons in the passing game, and now with a matchup going up against Cincy, who allows over 20 fantasy points per game to the tight end position, this one is a no-brainer. Also, Theo Johnson of the New York Giants coming off the bye, 40% owned going up against Washington. And Washington is one of the best matchups an opposing tight end can have as well. Washington is allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends, so this one just makes sense. Don't forget Jackson Dart, Theo Johnson, they're best friends off the field, and he could be looking his way in a great matchup this week going up against the Commanders. Now, he is 40% owned, but being that he was on bye last week, there may have been some people that dropped him to fill his place. Maybe there's people that have been overlooking him for a while. A great potential option this week at the tight end position. So how do we rank these guys? And we'll go through this 1 through 13. Now, obviously, I don't value quarterbacks and tight ends the least, but not everyone needs a streaming quarterback or tight end, especially in Week 15. So I have them ranked by position at the bottom of the rankings because I know a lot of people are out there looking for those wide receivers and running backs. So at the top of the list, it's still Blake Corum of the Los Angeles Rams. He's going to have a role the rest of the regular season, which means he should have a role in fantasy football as well. Chris Rodriguez looks to be the leader in that backfield to end out 2025. He's doing a lot with a little. He's breaking off huge runs, and maybe he's not the highest scoring running back, but if you're in a pinch and need a flex, solid option rest of season. Then Jaden Higgins, he also has rest of season value, followed by Luther Burden. If we do not have Rome Odunze anymore, Burden could have a role rest of season. This is really why these guys are at the top of the list. They have rest of season value. They're not a 1-week plug and play. Along with Jaden Reed, tough matchup this week. If you need him and you start him, you could be disappointed, but remember Week 16 looks really good. Then we have Jalen Wright. We don't even know if we're going to be able to use him or not, so he's a little bit lower. Same thing with Ryan Flournoy and Devin Singletary, because we're really unsure whether or not how big of a role Tyrone Tracy is going to have. Now, if you need a quarterback, I have them in this order: Tyler Shuck, Shedeur Sanders, and Marcus Mariota. If you're looking for a tight end, it's Isaiah Likely and then Theo Johnson. So now that we've ranked them, are we starting or stashing these guys? And for the most part, at this point of the fantasy football season, almost everyone that we're recommending could be started. Does that mean that I want to start them? Maybe not. Blake Corum has a difficult matchup this week going up against Denver. It's going to be iffy, but he could see between 12 and 15 touches, so he could have flex upside in a difficult matchup. We also have guys like Jaden Reed. I would prefer to stash him this week going up against Denver. You could use him in week 16 against Chicago, or just block your opponent from picking him up at this point. But everyone else, I have listed as a start as of right now. With Jalen Wright, Ryan Flournoy, and Devin Singletary need to have a little asterisk next to it because they're really dependent on the health of the people in front of them. Jalen Wright will not be a start if Devon Achane is a full go. Ryan Flournoy will not be a start if CeeDee Lamb clears concussion protocol, and Devin Singletary will be a fringe start at best if Tyrone Tracy is a full go in week 15 as well. As for the quarterbacks and tight ends, if we're recommending them in a show like this, it's because they have streaming potential and would be a start as well. Which brings us to FAAB budget recommendations, and the season is almost over. There is no reason to end the year with FAAB money still in your budget. So if there's a need for your team or a way to block something from an opponent, do it now. So with that being said, at the top of the list, we got Blake Corum up to 25%, along with Chris Rodriguez, Jaden Higgins, Luther Burden, Jaden Reed up to 20% of your remaining FAAB budget. Jalen Wright, Ryan Flournoy, Devin Singletary, 15% at best because we do not even know if they're going to be useful to us this week. Then we have the quarterbacks, Shuck, Sanders, and Mariota, only 10% if you need them. Hopefully it's only for 1 week, and you don't have to pay a lot of money for a 1 week stopgap. For the tight ends, I'll go up to 15%. I love the matchups this week for both of these guys, and if you're in need of a tight end, maybe you lost Zach Ertz this past week, if you can grab one of these guys, it's probably best case scenario for what's available currently on the waiver wire. Now, maybe you need some streaming Ds this weekend. We got a couple options like the Jags, the Jacksonville Jaguars going up against the Jets. We saw Tyrod go down with a groin injury last week, and Justin Fields was ruled out in week 14 as well. Now, if Fields doesn't play this week, that means the Jets start Brady Cook once again, and the Jags defense becomes a solid option. How about the Cowboys going up against Minnesota? I know J.J. McCarthy played much better in week 14, but against an improved Dallas defense on primetime Sunday Night Football, a couple of turnovers would not surprise me in the least. Then lastly, it's the Dolphins going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Miami, maybe one of the most underrated defenses right now in fantasy. They have scored at least 9 points in 4 straight games, and this Pittsburgh offense has been known to stall at times. So if you're looking for a streaming D, these are 3 options potentially out there on the waiver wire that you can capitalize on. But all right, there you have your week 15 waiver wire show, and I want to leave you with this one piece of advice. I kind of mentioned it throughout the show, but don't forget, you're not just looking for the need of your team during a week like this. In the fantasy playoffs, leading into the fantasy playoffs, you're also trying to block your future opponents from maybe a piece that they need. Maybe you have a piece on the bottom of your bench that's never going to sniff your starting lineup, but there's someone out there on waivers that potentially your opponent could pick up and hurt you with. Go grab those guys. Go block them from your teammates. I know in fantasy football, we love that offense. We want to see those big numbers. But at this time of the year, one of the best things you can do is also play good defense.